Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture or pictures that are famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do. And I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please wait for the like button to be taking a shower and then flush the toilet. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. Andrew Macaulay was an adventurer. He started as a rock climber and mountaineer, putting up dozens of big wall routes in Australia, as well as alpine first ascents in New Zealand, Patagonia, and the Himalayas. In the 1992s, he took little interest in the marquee peaks. He preferred obscure, lesser-known peaks that were more challenging and complex. But in 1998, he fell nearly 30 meters during a climb and shattered his knee, which made it almost impossible to climb at the level he was climbing at before the injury. This injury, that initially seemed like a really big setback because he loved mountain climbing, it ultimately spawned his true-life passion that he didn't even know about, and that was sea kayaking. He took to kayaking because it didn't really require the use of his legs, and so he was able to continue to push the limits of his mental and physical endurance, but wasn't hampered by a knee injury. And much like his mountain climbing career, he very quickly began conquering all of the most difficult open ocean kayaking routes all around Australia and New Zealand to the point where he had done all of them. The only one he had not done was the Tasman Sea. Andrew estimated it would take him approximately 1 month, or maybe a little bit longer, to cross the 1,000-mile journey. Now, his biggest obstacle was not going to be his own physical or mental endurance. It was going to be the weather. Because you're going to be out on the water for at least 30 days, there really isn't a weather window you can shoot for. You can't time this journey so you don't hit a storm. It's more about when you hit the storms, how will your kayak hold up? Other kayakers that had attempted going across the Tasman Sea had used these custom-built kayaks that had these elaborate canopies over the top of them. And they had these self-righting systems where, if it flipped, it automatically popped right back up. But Andrew wanted to do it with just a basic kayak. He didn't want all the bells and whistles. He wanted this to be kind of pure. But he did need to create a sort of system to protect himself in the middle of one of these storms. And so, he literally went into his backyard and constructed this fiberglass that looked like a trash can that sat over his cockpit on the kayak that he could remove and put on the back of his kayak. And then, if he wanted to sleep, he could put it over him and it was sealed and watertight, and it would protect him from the storm. And if he flipped over, he wouldn't just sink and drown. He called this dome Casper, and he painted a big smiley face on it. So, after months and months of preparing for this journey, finally, on January 11, 2007, Andrew would kiss his wife and his young son goodbye. He would hop in his kayak along with Casper, and he would set sail on his solo journey across the Tasman Sea. For the first 2/3 of the trip, it seemed to be going extremely well. Andrew was checking in regularly on his radio. He had enough food and water. His kayak was holding up. Casper was holding up great at night. So, he was able to get some sleep. But some really bad storms that he was anticipating began rolling in kind of all at once in that final third of the journey. During one particularly bad storm, Andrew would remain locked underneath Casper for 28 straight hours as these 30-foot waves would just wreak havoc outside, flipping his kayak over multiple times. I mean, just absolutely terrifying stuff. Inside his kayak, he had this beacon that, if you push the button, it would send a GPS signal to the rescue crew. They would immediately come out and they would save him. And the whole time he's getting thrashed around out in the middle of the ocean, he never presses the button. Because much like he didn't want to have all the bells and whistles on his kayak, he also didn't want any help. So instead, he would send kind of sarcastic text messages to the people on shore, making light of the situation he was in. Like, during the storm, he sent a text message that just said, "No picnic today." 12 days after that particular storm where he was locked inside for 28 hours, he had made it to within 80 miles of the finish line. And so he texts his wife and just says, "See you Sunday at Nina." This was on a Thursday, and so when his wife, Vicky, gets this text message, she's so excited. She gets together everybody that wants to meet him at the finish line, and in fact, they all go there early on Thursday to just hang out and camp out until he arrives. But 24 hours after that text message was sent to his wife, Andrew would send a distress signal to the New Zealand Coast Guard. On the recording, Andrew sounds desperate. He also sounds deeply fatigued or maybe even hypothermic, and he's pleading with them to come rescue him because his kayak is sinking. At first, people, including the Coast Guard, thought this could be a hoax because Andrew was so competent out on the water, and he had just gotten in touch with his wife the day earlier saying, "Everything's great. I'm almost done. I've made it past all the hard stuff. See you on Sunday." But of course, they still send out a search crew that night to look for Andrew. They can't find him. So the next day, on Saturday, they expand their search and they do find Andrew's kayak. Except Andrew's not in it. The only thing missing was the canopy to the kayak. The rest of the kayak seemed to work just fine. His distress beacon had not been pressed. His GPS was still there, and his camera was still there. No one knows what happened to Andrew in his final hours before he ultimately disappeared. The prevailing theory is he must have been capsized and separated from his kayak, and then was unable to either get back to it or even climb back in because he was so tired. This is the final picture that was taken on Andrew's camera, and you can tell from his expression that he's not particularly happy to be in the situation he's in. And in fact, in some of the earlier video clips he shot, he actually says to the camera that he feels like he bit off more than he could chew, and that he wishes he could just be home with his wife and his son. Despite extensive search efforts, Andrew was never found. In 2005, Addie Hall met Zach Bowen when they were both bartending in New Orleans. Addie liked to give Zach a really hard time and kind of played the mean girl as her way of flirting with him. But really what she was doing is testing Zach to see if he could put up with her, because she had a mean streak. She would have these crazy, angry outbursts and would yell and scream at people around her, and then she'd turn it off, just like that. And she needed to make sure that he could put up with her. Zach, it would turn out, had his own mean streak and his own angry outbursts, and so in many ways they were very similar. Many of Zach and Addie's friends that were around them in those first few weeks they were together did not think this relationship would last very long, because very long, of how often they fought with each other. But it just so happened that Zach and Addie had met one another just weeks before Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans and just devastated the area. And so before it arrived, Zach and Addie decide, let's stick it out. Let's stay here together. Let's ride this storm out together. And it was actually that storm that brought them together, and they both fell madly in love with each other and became totally inseparable. After the storm cleared, Zach and Addie went out into the streets and began cooking food for people, and they had all this alcohol in their apartment. And they set up a makeshift bar outside in the French Quarter and were just giving away drinks to these people whose lives had been devastated by the storm. Their tale of love and colorful survival has attracted many media outlets, including the New York Times, who did a feature on them. For a time, Zach and Addie felt like the king and queen of the French Quarter, and they were so happy. But when reality set back in, and the real cleanup ensued, and electricity was restored, and people started moving back into their homes, and people started going to work again, Zach and Addie were forced back into their old lifestyle, something neither of them wanted to experience again. So for the next year, Zach and Addie struggled to make ends meet. Their bills continued to pile up, and really, those two were at each other's throats all the time with these horrible, vicious fights. In October of 2006, when it seems like Zach and Addie's relationship is really on the rocks, they decide, in order to reinvigorate their relationship, they're going to move out of their current apartment where there's lots of bad memories, and they're going to move into a new one. They found a little apartment over the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street, and they immediately made a cash offer and they moved in. No sooner had they moved in did Addie go down to the landlord and say, remove Zach from the lease. She had found out that he was cheating on her and she was preparing to kick him out of her life. Zach found out that he was not on the lease before Addie could confront him about it, and it turned into this wicked fight between the two of them. A couple of days later, Zach showed up for work at the bar, and some of his co-workers recalled that he was acting really funny. He was wearing a hat pulled down low over his head and sunglasses, and was really quiet. And when anybody asked him, like, "What's going on with you? Why are you acting so strange?" he would just tell them he was fine and would quickly walk away from them. Around the same time, Addie stopped showing up for work at all, and her co-workers turned to Zach and said, "Where's Addie?" And he would say that they got into this fight and that Addie had actually left New Orleans and gone back to her hometown in North Carolina. And some people thought that was a little bit fishy because Addie loved New Orleans, but anybody that knew Addie knew she was very unpredictable. And if they had had this huge blowout fight, it is possible that she could have left for North Carolina. A week later, on October 17th, 2006, the New Orleans police received a phone call from a hotel in the area that spotted what they think is a body laying on the roof of their parking garage. When the police arrived, they could tell it was a deceased man and that he had died from impact, but they couldn't tell if it was a murder, a suicide, or a tragic accident. So they began searching his body to see if there was any indication of what happened, and they pull out a note that's addressed to police in his back pocket. The note is fairly long, but he communicates to the police that this was not an accident. "I had to take my own life because I took a life, and if you go to my apartment on Rampart Street, you'll find the body of my girlfriend, Addie Hall, who I killed." Police rushed to the address that was given in the note. They're horrified at what they find inside. As soon as they stepped into the apartment, the temperature dropped. The air conditioning had been set to the lowest it could possibly be, so it's very cold in the apartment. And they look around and they see these strange messages spray painted all over the walls. Things like, "I'm a total failure," and "Look in the oven." And there are arrows pointing on designed to hold the amount of radioactive materials that were being put inside of it. And so, as Zuchi and his colleague are creating this mixture, a very dangerous event occurred known as criticality. One of the survivors, who was sitting away from the tank behind a desk, described this event as being an extremely loud bang followed by this blue flash that filled the entire room. And what that blue light was extremely high levels of radiation. And because Uchi was the one kind of leaning over the tank, it all went right through him. By the time a rescue crew got in the room to help them, Uchi is uncontrollably vomiting and he's lightheaded and dizzy. He does not have any physical wounds. This was not an explosion, so there's no lacerations or anything on his body. But he had been exposed to 17 sievert tests of radiation, which is the highest amount of radiation any human being has ever been exposed to in documented history. Uchi was airlifted to a hospital, and doctors and nurses were actually kind of amazed at how well he was doing in those first few days. Again, he did not have any burn marks or anything on his body. He did have a little bit of redness on his right arm, which was positioned directly over the tank when this criticality event occurred, but he was in good spirits and was even joking around with the staff about how he can't wait to get home. In reality, Uchi died as soon as he was exposed to that criticality event and received 17 sievert tests of radiation. He was in what's known as walking ghost phase, where due to high levels of radiation, all of his chromosomes had been obliterated, which meant his body did not have a blueprint to reproduce cells. So basically, he appeared alive and well because his body had created all of these cells in his body before the accident, but as those cells died off, they would not be reproduced. Which means in walking ghost phase, your body is turning into a corpse, but you're alive to watch it happen. Tragically, after doctors discovered this about his condition, they informed Uchi of what was going on. Uchi did not seem to think there could be that serious of consequences for being exposed to that level of radiation. He felt like he was in the clear. He had made it past a couple of days. He thought maybe at worst he would develop leukemia later in life because he thought that was a thing with radiation. And really, his concern was that he might have to stay in the hospital for a little bit longer. He just wanted to go home. 3 weeks after the accident, his intestines began to hemorrhage and his skin fell off. All of it. They attempted numerous skin grafts to try to keep his bodily fluids inside of him, but none of them took. So they began wrapping him in gauze like he was a mummy. By November 27th, which is 2 months after the accident, miraculously he was still alive. However, his pain levels were so high they had to put him into a medically induced coma. While he was in the coma, his heart would stop and he would need to be resuscitated 3 separate times. And on the 3rd time he was brought back, he would say, "Stop. Stop. Get out of the room. Leave me alone." But they didn't stop, because the doctors and nurses were very interested in studying the effects of this level of radiation and how well he would respond to treatment, and just trying to learn as much as they could about this event because it had never happened before, and they probably justified it by saying this will save other people's lives. But what that meant is Uchi would need to suffer unbelievable levels of pain. Nearing the end, when Uchi could still speak, he told the doctors and nurses repeatedly that he is not a guinea pig. Finally, a do not resuscitate order was put in place, and in relative short order, Uchi passed away after 83 days of just unbelievable agony. The truly famous picture that is associated with this story is unbelievably graphic, and I did not want to share it on this channel. However, if you feel so inclined, it's not that difficult to find online. This picture, however, is equally disturbing because it's Uchi right after he's arrived at the hospital. He is in that walking ghost phase. All of his chromosomes have been obliterated. He is effectively dead right now in this picture. He just doesn't know it yet. So that's gonna do it, guys. Let me know what you thought of these 3 stories, and I'll pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please wait for the like button to be taking a shower, and then flush the toilet. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, read it, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, guys, that's gonna do it. See ya. If you suffer from claustrophobia, this is probably not a good video for you. But before I get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and line the floor next to their bed with Lego pieces, and then set off their fire alarm. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. In New Mexico, there is a very deep body of water called the Blue Hole that formed after this huge sinkhole filled with water. And because the visibility inside of the Blue Hole is so good, it's become a very popular swimming and underwater diving site. But at the bottom of the Blue Hole, 84 feet down, there is this little, tiny opening that almost looks like a drain at the bottom of your bathtub. Except it's just big enough that a grown person with scuba tanks on could wriggle through it. And if they did, they'd be entering into a vast network of tunnels and caves that have never been mapped, and many of them have never been explored. In 1976, two recreational divers from Oklahoma were exploring that deep section of the Blue Hole when they got lost and drowned. When the police went in, they started to get lost themselves. And when they finally located the bodies and brought them up again, they told the owners of the land that the Blue Hole was on that section of the cave is incredibly dangerous, and until you get someone in here to professionally map it out, you really should not be letting anyone go down there. So the owners decided, you know what decided? Instead of mapping this out, let's just seal it off permanently. And so they put this huge metal grate over it and bolted that down. And then they put a whole bunch of boulders over that sealed up metal grate. Fast forward to 2016, and an elite diving organization called the ADM Exploration Foundation that literally goes around the world exploring unpaid caves and professionally maps them. They reached out to the owners of the Blue Hole cave and said, hey, we'd be happy to map out your forbidden section. And the owners granted them permission. So this would be the first time in 40 years that anyone had been in the deepest section of the Blue Hole. One of the divers that was going to be on this excursion was a guy named Shane Thompson. He had been a diving instructor for the United States Navy before becoming an advanced scuba instructor in San Diego. All in, he had about 20 years of diving experience, most of it the cave diving variety. On March 26, 2016, the boulders were removed and the grate was unbolted, and the entrance to the forbidden section of the Blue Hole was now open. Shane had actually been told to stay on land as a safety standby diver while another diver named Mike Young was going to be the first into the cave and would just explore the upper section. But as soon as Mike Young got in the water that morning, a couple minutes later, Shane was in the water after him. And Mike remembers as he was making his way down the main cavern section before getting to the actual forbidden entrance, looking up and seeing Shane coming towards him and thinking, I thought he was supposed to stay on land, but figured someone must have told him to go in. And so, he didn't think much about it, and so Shane and Mike continued down to the entrance. Shane would be the first one to wriggle his way through this very claustrophobia-inducing entrance. Once he was through, Mike followed after him. And at this point, it's pitch black. I mean, there's a little bit of light up in the main cavern, but once you're down below in the forbidden section, you can't see anything. So they both got their high-powered flashlights out, and immediately as they're kicking it out down the tunnel, they realize there's a lot of silt inside of this section. I mean, no one's been down here in 40 years, so everything is just kind of settled. And so their lights aren't really that good. It would be like driving in really intense fog and turning on your high beams. That's not going to do anything. You're just going to illuminate the fog around you. But they were kind of expecting this, so they just slowly made their way forward before Shane identified a tunnel that kind of branched off to the right. And so Shane is pointing his light down this tunnel. Mike sees Shane pointing it, so he goes up and he looks too. And they can see there's an opening at the end of this tunnel, maybe 20-30 feet down, that appears to open up into a much larger cavern. But what they were not able to see from their position, or perhaps just in haste they didn't realize this, is the tunnel actually starts big and then funnels down to almost a point. And in order to get into that larger cavern at the end of the tunnel, you basically need to force yourself through that hole. It is not an easy space to fit through. Either way, Shane takes off first. Mike follows him. And as they're moving down this tunnel, the silt is getting kicked up very dramatically all around them. And so now they cannot tell that the walls are basically closing in on them. And as they're getting closer and closer to what they think is going to be this huge cavern, they actually suddenly get stuck. Shane gets stuck first. Mike comes up alongside him. Because it's so silty he can't see, and he swims right between Shane's leg and the wall and gets wedged. Mike stays calm and begins to push himself backwards to just retreat out of the situation he is in. He can't see anything, but he can tell what he needs to do. Shane, meanwhile, who's basically right in front of him, he starts kicking like a madman. In fact, his fins are hitting Mike in the head, and all the silt is getting kicked up. And so Mike just continues to push himself back, all the way back about 10 or 15 feet, while Shane, in a total panic, instead of coming backwards towards Mike, begins going forward through this tiny little narrow opening and somehow manages to force himself into this chamber. Mike has retreated back out to the main hallway, and he's just waiting for Shane to do the same thing. But when he never shows up, Mike goes back down the tunnel. He goes right up to the little entrance into this cavern and he pokes his head in and he scans the light around, and he doesn't see Shane anywhere. But he sees right away that there's all these different exits into different tunnels that shoot all over this cavern. And remember, this is a totally unexplored section, and so there's no way for him to know where any of these go. But he knows Shane had to have gone this way. It's only been a few moments. He's got to be in here somewhere. And so he takes a deep breath and he begins forcing himself through this tiny little hole, which took him quite a while because Shane, when he went through, it was adrenaline and panic that pushed him through, which is probably why he did it so quickly. Mike really struggled to get through it, but once he was through, he pointed his light up and he looked for the biggest opening to one of those tunnels. And he begins swimming up after Shane. And after a very long and windy and at times incredibly narrow path where Mike is second-guessing himself why he's even doing this, he manages to get to the end and it's a dead end. And curled up at the very back of the dead end was Shane. His mouthpiece was out, and he was deceased. Mike was unable to recover him this day. He had to go all the way back out, force himself back through that hole, and go up to the surface and get some other people involved before they could come back and recover his body. So the running theory is that when Shane panicked and began swimming through that tight little space into that chamber, he must have somehow believed that he had gotten turned around and was making his way towards the exit. Now, it's easy for us to say, dude, you're in a tight little tunnel and you couldn't even get out. How could you have possibly turned around? But in reality, when you're stuck hundreds of feet underground in a tunnel that is unexplored, silt's been kicked up all around you. Someone's blocking your way behind you. There's something blocking your way ahead, and you're pinched all around on your side by rocks. The mind can do some pretty crazy and delusional things. And once he pushed through that hole, using adrenaline to force himself through, he went up thinking, I'm gonna get out. I'm gonna get out. Except he went into a dead end. And by the time he reached the end, either his mouthpiece was knocked out or he passed out and he dropped the mouthpiece out of his mouth. But either way, it shows you what can happen when you are trapped underwater and you panic. After Shane's body was recovered, they resealed the forbidden section, and to this day, no one is allowed to go in again. Indian Springs is a very popular underwater diving location in Florida. Deep below the surface, there are hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels that are both explored and unexplored. The majority of the unexplored tunnels are down at the 300-foot mark, which is significantly deeper than the average recreational diver goes. In fact, below 120 feet, you need specialized equipment and training, and very few people have that. In November of 1991, a specially trained, specially qualified group of elite divers went to Indian Springs to conduct a research dive down at the 300-foot mark. They were basically looking for unexplored passageways that they could explore and map out. There was a number of divers that were going to be a part of this dive, but the only two that were going to be passing through something called Squaws Restriction were Parker Turner and Bill Gavin. Squaws Restriction is this very narrow section of Indian Springs that's located down at the 120-foot mark. If you think of Indian Springs like an hourglass, you have a big open space up top, you get a big open space down below, and Squaws Restriction is that tiny little space in the center of the hourglass. Before they began this dive, They threw a line down through squall's restriction, all the way down to the 300-foot mark that had an anchor at the end of it. And this would serve as their guideline so that when they were going down deep, if silt kicked up or visibility was obstructed for any reason, they always had a way to reference where they needed to go up or down. On the morning of November 17th, Bill and Parker put on their dive gear, they fired up their underwater scooters they were using, and they began their descent. They made it down to squall's restriction, and one by one they would lead with their scooter and their body would follow along past. And each of them were able to get through without any issue. Once on the other side, they took note that on the wall next to them, and this will matter later on, they noticed a sign that had been placed there. It was a very distinctive up and down arrow to show upstream and downstream flows. And so they took mental note that there was this distinctive arrow sign right at the bottom of squall's restriction, and they continued down. They stopped at 140 feet and they kind of looked around for a couple of minutes before continuing all the way down to 300 feet, which is where they were intending to go. And they explored for about 25 minutes before looking at their watches and saying, "Yep, we gotta go back up." So with one hand on their scooters and one hand on the guideline, they begin making their ascent. As they're getting closer and closer to squall's restriction, they start noticing these huge clouds of silt just in the middle of the water all around them. And they didn't cause this. They were not in an area where it was so tight they were kicking up silt. And it had been quite a while before they had come down through squall's restriction. So this really couldn't be the silt that they had kicked up when they had first come into the cave. And so they looked at each other and thought, that's a little bit weird. I wonder what's going on above us. But they both kind of shrugged and thought, man, can't be that big of a deal. And again, holding on to that guideline, they keep on going up until their hands stop. Because the guideline is now leading them into sand and rock and mud, as if the guideline is going into the wall. And they're looking at what they're holding on to, and it doesn't make any sense. Without communicating at all, they both are thinking, okay, let's go back down and make sure we're in the right place because it seems like we hit a dead end here. And so they turn around, and as they're going down the guideline, now again, there's no other lines down here. There isn't another way to get mixed up, but it's human instinct to think, let me just retrace my footsteps first. As they're going down, they see on their left the distinctive up and down arrow that they saw when they came in, and that's when they stopped and looked at each other, and they realized squall's restriction has caved in. We're trapped in. Each of the men had a slate where they could use a grease pen to write a message and hold it up and show their dive partner, and that was how they communicated. And at this point, Parker wrote, "What are we gonna do now?" And Bill wrote back, "Let's look around." And so they turn around and they follow the guideline back up to the cave-in, and they start trying to clear the debris away. But they're finding it almost impossible because as soon as they move something out of the way, whatever is on top just pushes down into it and fills it back in. After a couple of minutes of doing that, and all the silt is in their faces, they couldn't even hold their slates up to talk to each other because the visibility was so bad. So they both went lower in the water column to where there was no silt around them. They both looked at each other, and that's when Parker held up his air gauge and showed Bill, "I only have about 10 minutes of air left." And that's when Bill looked at his air gauge and he realized he too only had about 10 minutes of air left. Parker scribbles something on his slate and he holds it up to Bill, and it just says, "What are we gonna do now?" And Bill, not knowing what else to say, just wrote, "Hold on, I'll take a look." So Bill leaves the guideline and swims over to another section away from squall's restriction in hopes he might find some other exit out of the space they're in, even though he knew full well there wasn't anything besides squall's restriction. And after a couple of minutes of looking around and not finding an additional exit, he goes back over to where Parker had been when he had left him, except Parker's not here anymore. And Bill suddenly thinks maybe he's found a way to get through this. And so Bill, with almost nowhere left, grabs the guideline and swims up into the silty cloud and gets to the cave and to discover it's still caved in to discover. However, he sees the base of Parker's tanks wedged in the obstruction itself, and he's looking at the tanks thinking, how did Parker get in that position? And then he realizes that's just his tanks. Parker is not attached to them anymore. And that's when Bill realizes what Parker probably had done. Parker had tried to force himself through the obstruction and probably got about halfway before becoming completely wedged and stuck himself. And he had to make the terrifying decision to take one more good breath and then ditch your air tanks and try to swim on a breath hold to the set of spare tanks they had set up about 100 meters away above squaw's restriction. But at this point, regardless what's happened with Parker, his tanks were positioned in a way that it had created a little bit of an opening in the obstruction that Bill was able to swim through with his tanks. Oh, and now he has almost no air left, and so once he got through, he realized he had about 30 seconds of air, and he swam as fast as he could to these spare tanks, hoping to see Parker on them, breathing unalive. But unfortunately, right as they came into view, Parker wasn't anywhere to be seen. Bill swims as fast as he can. He actually literally runs out of air and is on a breath hold himself by the time he reaches these tanks. He takes a huge gulp of air. After he calmed down, he took his light out and he scanned around, and he found Parker. And he was floating, deceased, clearly about 30 meters away. He had made it pretty far on a breath hold, but it just gone slightly off and he didn't have any of his equipment. It was all attached to his tanks, and so in total darkness, he was just blindly swimming and did not locate the air tanks. And you can only imagine what his final few seconds were like. Before all of this happened, when Parker and Bill were down at 300 feet, some of the limestone broke off from the ceiling, landed in such a way that it caused this huge underwater mudslide, and it all funneled down, completely blocking up squaw's restriction. For any diver who can stomach the risks, Bushman's Hole is a world-class diving spot. It's located on a privately owned game farm in South Africa. In the middle of the farm's 11,000 acres sits this massive crater in the ground that from rim to rim is hundreds of feet wide. If you hike down the crater to the middle, there's this little, tiny basin of water that almost looks like an oversized puddle. This is the entrance to Bushman's Hole. Once you step into this little puddle and push your way through the very claustrophobia-inducing entrance, you open up into the biggest freshwater cave in the world that goes down to nearly 900 feet. For the people that have been in there, they say it's unbelievable and it's like spacewalking. For young South African Dion Dreyer, the pull to go to Bushman and explore, it was irresistible. Dion had always been a bit of an adrenaline junkie. By the time he was 17, he was racing cars and building motorcycles. And by the time he was 20, he had picked up a new activity, cave diving. Dion had logged about 200 dives before he was invited by a diving group to go to Bushman's Hole and explore it on Christmas break 1994. They were planning a descent to 492 feet, so about the halfway point of the cave, and they needed one more diver, and so Dion was thrilled to go. The dive was going great, but on the way up as they were making their ascent, the diver ahead of Dion looked back at him and Dion seemed fine. He gave the hand signal that everything was going great. He had his flashlight out, and then about 30 feet higher in the water, that same diver turned around to check on Dion and Dion wasn't there anymore. And in fact, this guy saw his flashlight that was still attached to him basically wavering as it sunk farther and farther down Bushman's Hole. This diver immediately stops the group above him, and he turns around and starts swimming as fast as he can down to try to get to Dion. But Dion was sinking so quickly, this diver realized that it's a suicide mission if I try to go down there. I will either pass out or run out of air. And so, deeply saddened, this group of divers had to turn around and leave Dion at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Although the other divers didn't know for sure, they told Dion's parents that most likely he had suffered from a deep water blackout and then had drowned. Authorities were notified about what happened to Dion. They sent a robot down to the bottom of Bushman's Hole to just locate his body before they sent a person down there, but they never could find his body. They could only ever find his helmet. Dion's parents are devastated. They're never going to see their son again, and since they don't have a body to bury, they decide to go down to Bushman's Hole and put a plaque up next to the entrance to commemorate their son. 10 years later, Dave Shaw, who was a 50-year-old, extremely audacious cave diver, was passing the 800-foot mark inside of Bushman's Hole, becoming the third person ever to reach this depth. Shaw touched down on the sloping bottom of the cave. He detached from the cave reel, took out his flashlight, and began swimming around the bottom. As he was scanning around, He looked about 50 feet to his left and he saw something. He immediately recognized it was a human body. They were on their back with their arms stretched out towards the surface. And when Shaw went over to them, he immediately recognized that this is Dion Dreyer. Ever since Dion died inside of Bushman Inn had never been recovered. Any diver that went in there was keeping their eye out in case they saw him. Shaw examines Dion to see if he's going to be able to be pulled to the surface, if he's solid enough to be pulled to the surface. And he can tell that his hands have skeletonized as well as his skull, although his mask is still placed directly on his skull. But his wetsuit and his tanks have kind of kept the rest of his body pretty tight, which gave him some mass, which meant he'd be able to move him. But as soon as Shaw tried to move him, he couldn't get him to budge because his tanks were caught on something. And so Shaw stayed there for a minute trying to get him free, but he couldn't do it. And that's when Shaw started to think, okay, this is getting irresponsible. I'm gonna die down here too if I don't start making my ascent soon. So he ended up tying a line to Dion's body so he could be located again, and then Shaw began the very slow ascent back to the surface. On the way back up, Shaw felt an extreme sense of connection with Dion. He really felt bad for this kid, and all he wanted to do was get him back on land, to get back to his family, to give them some closure. And so when he got on the surface, he immediately contacted authorities and said, I'm gonna go back down and I'm gonna get him. And Shaw also called Dion's parents and told them, I am gonna retrieve your son. And his parents were apparently overjoyed. They couldn't believe they were gonna get to see their son again. After lots and lots of planning, Shaw's recovery of Dion was scheduled for January 8, 2005. The dive was going to take 12 hours, and it wasn't just going to be Dave doing the retrieval. It was going to be like a relay race. Dave would be the first one down. In a couple minutes after he entered the water, another diver would go in who would stop about 100 feet above Dave. And then a third diver would go in and stop 100 feet above the second diver, and so on and so forth. Dave would put the body bag over Dion and then carry his body up to the first guy who would turn around, bring the body up to the next guy, and the next guy to the next guy, until Dion was out of the water. At 6:13 in the morning, Shaw entered the water with a camera on his helmet to film the operation. Shortly after he submerged, Dion's parents walked down to the edge of the water to watch. They showed up intentionally late so as not to put added pressure on Shaw. Shaw dropped very quickly to the bottom of Bushman's hole. He actually arrived about a minute and a half faster than he expected to. As soon as he got down, he shot terms with the reality that he was going to be down there with Dion, probably forever. The news was so devastating that the team decided to leave all their equipment in place. Eventually, they did need to go down and collect their gear, so everybody goes down to the edge of Bushman's Hole. And before they begin retrieving all of the lines, they sang Amazing Grace in Memoriam for the lost diver. Afterwards, they started pulling up the lines, and as they're doing that, they noticed all these bubbles coming up from the bottom of the cave. And they looked a little bit closer, and it was Shaw's body and Dion's body. Basically, Shaw had been attached to this line and he had managed to free Dion before he had passed. And so when they pulled the line, both of them were freed and they floated to the surface. And so, even though Shaw would die doing it, he was able to get Dion out of Bushman's cave for his family. After the two bodies were taken out, they noticed that the camera on Dave's head was still intact, and it had filmed everything all the way through his final moments. And so they took the tape out and they watched it forward and backwards, slow-mo, frame by frame, and they analyzed it to the point where they understood what happened. When Shaw gets down to Dion's body that had previously been stuck, and that was the reason Shaw had not been able to free him the first time. Somehow he's become unfree and he's now free-floating. And Shaw is having a really hard time trying to control this free-floating body, and his body is literally breaking apart in front of him. As Shaw is trying to wrangle his body, you can hear him start grunting. His breathing is getting elevated, and he's totally losing control of the situation. And the bottom of this cave is slanted and it's all silty and muddy, and so in the camera. You see all this mud and silt getting kicked around and the visibility is very poor. And after it clears, you see Shaw has gotten completely tangled in some line that it's also tangled on Dion. So basically, Dion has become his anchor at this point. Shaw shifts his focus to try to get the lines off of himself, and you can hear his breathing now is becoming much more desperate. It almost sounds like he's gulping for air, and probably at this point, although we don't know for sure, he's suffering from narcosis, which is a condition that divers will run into where it's like you drank a whole bunch of alcohol on an empty stomach. It's like you're totally drunk and you're confused. And it's clear that he's becoming a little bit disoriented. And instead of going away from Dion's body to try to go back up and save yourself, instead he turns and starts fumbling with Dion's midsection, and then he gets out a pair of scissors, but he doesn't use them. He just holds them. Finally, he turns away from Dion because it's clear you're not going to be able to get him out at this point, and with the scissors in hand that he never used because, again, he's probably suffering from narcosis and he's confused. He starts beginning to make his way over to the area where you can go back up. But he starts slowing down, his breathing becomes tragically desperate, and then it becomes silent, and then there's no more movement, and Dave Shaw is dead. 10 days after the bodies were recovered from Bushman's Hole, Dion's parents, although they are absolutely devastated about what happened to Shaw, they feel very guilty. But at the same time, they're so excited because they get to go to the morgue and see their son again for the first time in 10 years. They don't care what state his body's in, just the fact that he's actually here, that their actual son is going to be in front of them, was just overwhelming for them. And when they went in, they were really fixated on the fact that he had underwear on that they both recognized. Apparently, they had bought him a set of jockey underwear, and he was wearing jockey underwear. As strange as it is, it was like they got to bond with their child one more time. So that's gonna do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and line the floor next to their bed with Lego pieces, and then set off their fire alarm. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same for both platforms. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya, Gemini and OI. Today, I'm gonna share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm gonna share with you the picture that is famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all I do. And I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please take 3 pigs and label them 1, 2, and 4, and release them on the like button's property. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications, so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. 66-year-old Geraldine Largay was nicknamed Dinkworm by her friends for her hilariously slow hiking pace. But her slow pace didn't stop her from doing the thing that she loved, which was to hike. And in fact, on April 23, 2013, Geraldine, along with one of her close friends, Jane Lee, decided to embark on this nearly 1,000-mile-long hike through the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine's husband of 42 years, his name was George, he planned to drive ahead of the pair and meet them at prearranged spots along this 1,000-mile-long journey to give them supplies and would occasionally bring them to a motel so they could shower and sleep in a bed. By June 30th, so more than 2 months after they had started this journey, Jane finds out that she has a family emergency and she isn't able to continue this hike. Geraldine decided she was going to finish what she started on her own, despite the fact that, realistically, she hated hiking alone. She was very scared, frankly, of being out in the wilderness by herself, but she only had about 200 miles left, and so she figured, what the heck, I'll finish this thing out on my own. Later, Jane would tell investigators that when she left the trail to handle this family emergency, she felt like Geraldine was a little bit in over her head. She was someone that just didn't do well hiking on her own, and she still had 200 miles to go. But Jane just had too much going on in her life, and so she didn't stick around to try to convince Geraldine to come with her. Instead, she said, "Best of luck, Geraldine, and I'll see you at the end." So, for the next 3 weeks, Geraldine carried on down the Appalachian Trail on her own, and by all accounts, it was going really well. She was checking in with her family on saying, "This is the mile marker I'm at," and she was making all her rendezvous points with George to get respellite and to go to the motel with him. And so, everything was going great. Then, on July 22nd, Geraldine would send a text message to her husband, George, saying that she thinks she's in some trouble and that she lost the trail and is now lost. And she would ask him to call the Appalachian Mountain Club, see if they had a trail maintainer that could come out and look for her and kind of get her back on track. The problem was, Geraldine couldn't get these text messages to go through. There was very bad service where she was, so she begins to walk to higher ground to try to get a better cell-phone signal. And so, she goes up this hill, and she repeatedly tries to send these text messages out to George saying, "I'm lost and I need help," but none of them were going through. She would spend the whole night trying to send text messages from this mountain before finally putting her sleeping bag down and sleeping for the night. The next morning, she got up and she sent another text message, this one a little bit more urgent, to her husband. She told him that she was lost since yesterday and was off the trail 3 or even 4 miles, and that he should now call the police. But that message also failed. And so, none of her messages over the past 24 hours have been sent out, and so nobody knows that she's lost. But at some point that day, she decides, I'm gonna just put my phone away, save the battery life, and just wait. Because I'm supposed to meet my husband today, and when I don't show up, he's gonna call authorities. They're gonna come looking for me, and everything will be fine. She leaves the mountain and finds this area underneath a couple of trees that had some pine needles on the ground. It was relatively soft. She set up her tent underneath these trees. She hangs a silver reflective blanket up over one of the trees to try to signal to helicopters or anybody flying overhead. She even began burning some bark to create a smoke signal, and she proceeded to wait. And sure enough, later that day, George, who's waiting at the rendezvous point for his wife, she doesn't show up, and he immediately contacts the authorities, who launch a huge search to go find Geraldine. Tragically, Geraldine was actually only about a mile, maybe 2 miles off of the trail, so she was not far from where she needed to be. But because it was so densely forested, she had no way of knowing that, and sound didn't travel very well. So, over the course of the next 2 weeks, as this huge search with helicopters and planes and people on horseback and hunters and all these people in the area, they didn't find her. They might have come very close to her without knowing it, but again, because it was so densely forested, they never linked up. So on August 4th, about 2 weeks into this big search, they end up scaling it back and say, "Sorry, but we can't find her." The whole time this is going on, Geraldine stays at her campsite. She doesn't go anywhere. She figures this is my best chance to survive. And she's staying very positive. She has this journal that every day she would write inside of it a daily observation. And she would also write letters to her family. All of these messages were incredibly positive. She was very much expecting to be rescued and would have this great story to tell. But as days went on, no one was finding her. You could tell in her writing that she had come to terms with the reality she was not going to make it out of here alive. And so, before she died, she wrote this beautiful message to her husband and to her daughter. "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. Please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them." 2 years later, a forester would be in the area and would come across Geraldine's tent that was now crumpled and collapsed. And inside, he would find Geraldine inside of her sleeping bag with the journal over her chest. And inside the tent, she kept it neat and clean all the way to the very end. This is someone that went out with absolute grace. Back on July 22nd, 2013, the day Geraldine would go missing, she woke up and she was all smiles and motivated to start the day. She heads off down the Appalachian Rail at about 6:30 in the morning and she passes by another hiker who stops Geraldine. And apparently, this hiker saw Geraldine smile and said it was so infectious that she had to take a picture of her. And so, Geraldine laughed and posed for this picture. After the picture was taken, the women laughed about it and then went their separate ways. And then, by 11:00 a.m. that morning, Geraldine was lost. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground, and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police in there in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns in multiple blasts because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There's some real aggression here, This is not an accident. This is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings, there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so, for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so, the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open and, "Look, I just bought a new Rolex." His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on what fun thing am I going to do with my money next. After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So, For $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though, realistically, Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it, and she would tell the police. The police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly, Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion knowing exactly what they're gonna find. They go in and they put on this big performance. Oh my goodness, someone killed our parents. But it was all a lie because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons. But actually, just recently, they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA rating cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card, and he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card. Known as the Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell was, above all else, a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. So, starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hollow Bay. It was this big open green field, and all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay, and it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space. And every time he was just rolling the dice, cause eventually, they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe. But Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, then they respected him, and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska, because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive, Because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week. And he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, "Nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us." So he flies Amy in, and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the grizzly maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear, or more than one grizzly bear, had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual. But then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. And he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me. It's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal, and Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming, and eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror. And you hear the bear come back, and then her screams pick up, and then the tape goes quiet. This is the last picture of Timothy and Amy taken alive. It was taken right after Amy had landed in Alaska, and they were going to make their way up to the grizzly maze and camp out there for a few days in hopes of running into a grizzly bear. So, that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know what you thought about them in the comments, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please take 3 pigs and label them 1, 2, and 4, and then release them on the like button's property. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen over there. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, read it, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it, guys. See ya. Say hi, Henry. Let me take him so I can see what you look like. Hey, buddy. All right, look here. All right, I guess that's good, right? Your hair is... It's white. Yeah, I can't even control it now.